The fluorescent lights in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation lab hummed with the same relentless frequency they had maintained for the past 15 years, casting harsh shadows across Detective Evelyn Lewis's weathered face as she stared at the manila folder that had been haunting her dreams. The folder was thick now, bulging with witness statements, crime scene photographs, and dead-end leads that had accumulated like sediment in a riverbed. But today, something was different. Today the folder felt lighter in her hands, as if the weight of unanswered questions was finally beginning to lift. The call had come at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 2010, jarring Evelyn from the restless sleep that had become her companion since taking over the cold case division 3 years prior. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the State Crime Lab spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that words, once spoken, could never be taken back. "We have a match," she had said. And those 4 words carried the weight of a decade's worth of sleepless nights, dead ends, and a family's desperate hope for justice. Evelyn's fingers traced the edge of the photograph that had been paper-clipped to the inside cover of the file for so long that it had left permanent indentations in the cardboard. Sarah Michelle Crenshaw, age 19, smiled back at her with the radiant confidence of someone who believed the world held infinite possibilities. The photograph had been taken at her high school graduation, just 3 months before her body was discovered in the dense woods of Troup County on a sweltering August morning in 2000. 10 years. 10 years of following leads that evaporated like morning mist, of watching Sarah's parents age with the particular weariness that comes from grief without closure, of feeling the case slip further and further into the forgotten corners of an overloaded justice system. The coffee in Evelyn's mug had grown cold hours ago, but she continued to sip it mechanically as she reviewed the timeline that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Sarah had left her part-time job at the local Dairy Queen at 11:15 p.m. on August 3, 2000. Security footage from the restaurant showed her walking to her car, a red 1995 Honda Civic that her father had helped her buy with money saved from 2 summers of working at a vacation resort in Helen, Georgia. The car was found 3 days later in a Walmart parking lot 20 miles from where Sarah's body was discovered, keys still dangling from the ignition, her purse untouched on the passenger seat. Detective Marcus Webb, Evelyn's partner and the closest thing she had to a best friend, knocked softly on the doorframe of her office. At 55, Marcus carried himself with the measured gait of someone who had seen too much but refused to let cynicism consume his fundamental belief in justice. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the same intensity they had possessed when he first joined the force 28 years earlier. "The Crenshaws are here," he said quietly, understanding that this moment represented a turning point not just in the case, but in the lives of everyone it had touched. Robert and Linda Crenshaw sat in the small conference room that the department reserved for difficult conversations, their hands intertwined in the way of couples who had weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser partnerships. Robert, a soft-spoken man who had spent 30 years teaching high school mathematics, wore the same navy blue suit he had worn to every court hearing, every press conference, and every meeting with law enforcement officials over the past decade. Linda, a nurse at the county hospital, had taken the morning off work, something she rarely did even when she was sick, because she understood that this day might finally provide the answers they had been seeking. The evidence that had broken the case wide open was smaller than a grain of rice, invisible to the naked eye, but its implications stretched across a decade of investigation. DNA evidence recovered from beneath Sarah's fingernails had finally found a match in the national database, Thomas Eugene Hartwell, a 43-year-old construction worker who had been arrested 6 months earlier on charges of aggravated assault in Fulton County. Hartwell's DNA had been entered into the system as part of his processing, and the computer algorithm that ran continuously, searching for matches among millions of genetic profiles, had finally made the connection that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Evelyn's fingers traced the edge of the photograph that had been paper-clipped to the inside cover of the file for so long that it had left permanent indentations in the cardboard. Sarah Michelle Crenshaw, age 19, smiled back at her with the radiant confidence of someone who believed the world held infinite possibilities. The photograph had been taken at her high school graduation, just 3 months before her body was discovered in the dense woods of Troup County on a sweltering August morning in 2000. 10 years. 10 years of following leads that evaporated like morning mist, of watching Sarah's parents age with the particular weariness that comes from grief without closure, of feeling the case slip further and further into the forgotten corners of an overloaded justice system. The town of LaGrange, Georgia, had been different in 2000. Smaller and more insular, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children rode their bikes until streetlights came on. Sarah's murder had shattered that sense of security, introducing a darkness that seemed to settle over the community like fog. Parents began walking their teenagers to work, local businesses installed better lighting in their parking lots, and the cheerful innocence that had defined the town's character gave way to a more cautious, watchful atmosphere.
Dr. Martinez entered the conference room, carrying a thick folder and a laptop computer, her expression professional but not unkind. As the state's leading forensic geneticist, she had delivered news like this before, and she understood the delicate balance between providing scientific clarity and acknowledging the emotional weight of her findings. She was a woman in her 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested she was more comfortable in a laboratory than in formal settings. The DNA profile we recovered from the victim's fingernails is a perfect match for Thomas Eugene Hartwell, she began, her voice steady and clear. The probability of this being a coincidence is less than 1 in several billion. We also found trace amounts of Mr. Hartwell's skin cells on the victim's clothing, which suggests there was significant physical contact between them. Linda Crenshaw's hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears that had been building for 10 years. Robert reached for her other hand, squeezing it gently as he processed the information that would forever divide their lives into before and after this moment. Evelyn watched their faces carefully, seeing not just relief, but a complex mixture of emotions that included grief, anger, and something that might have been fear. The fear of finally having to confront the person who had destroyed their world. The investigation that had seemed hopeless just days before was now gaining momentum with each passing hour. Hartwell was currently being held in the Fulton County Jail on the assault charges, but Evelyn knew that would change quickly. She had already spoken with the district attorney, who was preparing arrest warrants for kidnapping and murder. The Georgia State Patrol was coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure that Hartwell remained in custody while the case was being prepared for trial. But questions remained, hanging in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. How had Hartwell encountered Sarah that night? Had he known her, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Had there been other victims, other families who had spent years waiting for answers that might never come? The DNA match was just the beginning of a new phase in the investigation, one that would require careful detective work to build a case strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of a jury. As the meeting concluded and the Crenshaws left the building, walking slowly toward their car with the measured steps of people who had just experienced a seismic shift in their understanding of the world, Evelyn remained in the conference room, staring at the photographs spread across the table. Sarah's face looked back at her from a dozen different angles. School pictures, family snapshots, the graduation photo that had become the public face of the case. But now, for the first time in 3 years, Evelyn felt something she had almost forgotten how to experience: hope. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the police station, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor as Evelyn made her way back to her office. The building was quieter now, the day shift giving way to the evening crew, but she knew she would be there for several more hours, reviewing files, making phone calls, and beginning the painstaking process of building a case against Thomas Eugene Hartwell. She had no way of knowing that this breakthrough would eventually lead to the resolution of 3 other cold cases, that Hartwell's arrest would generate tips from witnesses who had remained silent for years, or that Sarah's story would become a symbol of the importance of never giving up on the pursuit of justice. But she did know that somewhere in Fulton County, a man who had thought he had gotten away with murder was about to discover that time, technology, and the relentless dedication of people who refused to forget had finally caught up with him. Evelyn Lewis had never intended to become a detective, much less one who specialized in the cases that other investigators whispered about in break rooms and avoided whenever possible. She had started her career in law enforcement with the idealistic belief that justice was a straight line connecting crime to punishment, that the truth would always emerge if you worked hard enough and followed the evidence wherever it led. 22 years later, she understood that the truth was more like a river, sometimes flowing clear and direct, other times disappearing underground for miles before surfacing in unexpected places. Her morning routine had evolved over the years into a careful ritual designed to prepare her mind for the emotional weight of her work. She woke up at 5:30 a.m. without an alarm clock, her internal chronometer calibrated by years of early shifts and restless nights. The house she shared with her husband David was quiet at that hour, their 2 teenage children still hours away from consciousness. She would make coffee using the French press that David had given her for their 15th anniversary, standing at the kitchen window and watching the sunrise paint the sky above their suburban neighborhood in LaGrange. David Lewis worked as a guidance counselor at the local high school, a job that had given him insight into the complicated interior lives of teenagers and a deep appreciation for the vulnerability that accompanied the transition from childhood to adulthood. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, why Evelyn had been drawn to Sarah Crenshaw's case with such intensity. Every victim represented someone's child, someone's hopes and dreams cut short by violence that seemed to emerge from nowhere and strike with devastating randomness.
The cold case division occupied a corner of the building that other departments seemed to avoid, as if the accumulated weight of unsolved mysteries might be contagious. Evelyn's office was small but organized with military precision, filing cabinets arranged alphabetically, evidence boxes stacked according to case priority, and a bulletin board covered with photographs, maps, and timelines that told the stories of lives interrupted by tragedy. She had decorated the space with personal touches, a photograph of her family taken during their vacation to Savannah the previous summer, a small succulent plant that her daughter Emma had given her, and a coffee mug emblazoned with the words, "World's Okayest Mom," that made her smile every time she used it. Her colleagues respected Evelyn's dedication, but worried about the toll her work was taking on her personal life. Detective Captain James Morrison, a 25-year veteran who had promoted Evelyn to the cold case unit, frequently reminded her that the department offered counseling services and encouraged her to take vacation time. But Evelyn found it difficult to step away from cases that had been waiting years or decades for resolution, knowing that each day of delay might mean another day of anguish for families who deserved answers. The Crenshaw case had become more than just another file in Evelyn's cabinet. It had become a defining challenge of her career and a test of her faith in the system she had sworn to serve. She had studied every piece of evidence until she could recite the details from memory, had interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses until she knew their stories better than they did, and had spent countless hours driving the route between Sarah's workplace and the location where her body had been found, searching for details that previous investigators might have missed. Sarah had been working at the Dairy Queen to save money for college, planning to major in elementary education at the University of Georgia. Her manager, Janet Kowalski, had described her as reliable and cheerful, the kind of employee who volunteered for extra shifts and never complained about difficult customers. Sarah's coworkers remembered her talking excitedly about her upcoming freshman year, about her plans to join a sorority, and about her nervousness regarding living away from home for the first time. The night Sarah disappeared had been typical in every way that mattered. She had worked her regular shift, serving ice cream and hamburgers to families enjoying the last weeks of summer vacation. The security footage from the restaurant showed her cleaning tables, taking orders, and laughing with her coworkers during the brief lulls between customers. At 11:15 p.m., she had clocked out, said goodnight to Janet, and walked across the parking lot to her car, disappearing into the humid Georgia darkness. Evelyn had watched that security footage hundreds of times, studying Sarah's body language, looking for signs of distress or indication that she might have been aware of being followed. But Sarah appeared relaxed and unhurried, walking with the confident stride of someone who felt safe in familiar surroundings. She paused at her car to search through her purse for her keys, a gesture so ordinary and universal that it broke Evelyn's heart every time she witnessed it. The investigation that followed Sarah's disappearance had been thorough by the standards of 2000, but Evelyn knew that advances in forensic science had revealed the limitations of earlier techniques. DNA analysis had been available, but expensive and time-consuming, used primarily in cases where other evidence was lacking. The investigators had focused on Sarah's personal relationships, interviewing her boyfriend, her friends from high school, and her co-workers at the Dairy Queen. They had examined her financial records, her phone calls, and her computer usage, searching for any indication of risky behavior or dangerous associations. Thomas Hartwell's name had never appeared in the original investigation, a fact that now seemed to mock the hundreds of hours that dedicated officers had spent pursuing leads that led nowhere. In 2000, Hartwell had been 33 years old, working construction jobs across North Georgia and living in a rented trailer outside the town of Bremen. He had no prior arrests, no known connection to Sarah or her family, and no apparent reason to be in LaGrange on the night of August 3rd. He was, in the terminology of criminal investigators, a complete unknown. Evelyn's pursuit of the case had sometimes put strain on her relationship with her family, particularly with her teenage son Michael, who had begun to resent the long hours she spent at work and the distracted attention she gave to family activities. During his junior year of high school, he had confronted her directly, asking why she cared more about dead people than about her living children. The question had stung because it contained just enough truth to be devastating, forcing Evelyn to examine her motivations and priorities in ways that were both necessary and painful.
Her daughter, Emma, 2 years younger than Michael, had responded differently to her mother's work, becoming fascinated by the investigative process and asking detailed questions about forensic science and criminal psychology. Emma had announced her intention to study criminal justice in college, a decision that filled Evelyn with both pride and concern. She wanted her daughter to pursue her dreams, but worried about exposing her to the darkness that seemed to be an inevitable part of police work. David had been supportive throughout Evelyn's career transition into cold cases, understanding that her dedication came from a deep sense of justice rather than mere professional ambition. But he had also watched her struggle with the emotional weight of unsolved cases, had seen her wake up in the middle of the night with new theories about old evidence, and had listened to her rehearse presentations to prosecutors and crime lab technicians during dinner conversations that should have been about family matters and everyday concerns. The day the DNA results came back, Evelyn had called David before anyone else, needing to share the news with someone who understood what the breakthrough meant to her personally and professionally. His response had been characteristically thoughtful and supportive, congratulating her on the persistence that had finally paid off, while gently reminding her that the real work was just beginning. Building a case strong enough to secure a conviction would require months of additional investigation, and she would need to maintain her focus without allowing the pursuit of justice to consume her life entirely. The relationship between Evelyn and Marcus Webb had developed over their 3 years as partners into something resembling a sibling dynamic, characterized by mutual respect, gentle teasing, and an almost telepathic understanding of each other's investigative instincts. Marcus had spent most of his career working active cases, and his transition to cold case investigations had required him to adjust his expectations about the pace of progress and the nature of success. In active investigations, momentum was everything, with leads pursued immediately and suspects interviewed while memories were fresh. Cold cases required a different kind of patience, a willingness to wait years for a single piece of evidence to emerge from the accumulated debris of time. Marcus had been married to his wife Patricia for 31 years, a relationship that had survived the stresses of police work through careful attention to boundaries and communication. He made it a practice to leave work at the office whenever possible, understanding that the darkness of unsolved crimes could poison family relationships if allowed to spread beyond professional settings. But he had also understood Evelyn's dedication to the Crenshaw case and had never criticized her for the extra hours she devoted to pursuing leads that might have seemed marginal to other investigators. The morning after the DNA results were confirmed, Evelyn arrived at the office to find a handwritten note from Marcus on her desk. "Congratulations, Sarah would be proud." The simple message encapsulated everything she had been feeling, but had been unable to articulate. The sense that their investigation had been guided not just by professional duty, but by a responsibility to honor Sarah's memory and to ensure that her death would not be forgotten or dismissed as an unsolvable mystery. The case had also brought Evelyn into regular contact with victim advocates and social workers who specialized in helping families navigate the criminal justice system. She had learned about the secondary trauma that affected the relatives of murder victims,
the way that grief could become complicated by anger, frustration, and the feeling of powerlessness that accompanied waiting for justice. Linda and Robert Crenshaw had handled their tragedy with remarkable grace, but Evelyn had seen other families destroyed by the stress of unsolved cases, marriages ending in divorce, children struggling with behavioral problems, and parents developing depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. The work had also taught her about the importance of community support in sustaining families through prolonged investigations. The Crenshaws had been fortunate to live in a town where people remembered Sarah and continued to ask about the case, where local media periodically ran anniversary stories, and where the police department had committed resources to keeping the investigation active. But Evelyn knew that many cold cases languished not because they were unsolvable, but because public attention had moved on to newer tragedies, leaving families to advocate for their loved ones without the support systems that could make the difference between hope and despair. As she prepared to interview Thomas Hartwell for the first time, Evelyn found herself thinking about the circular nature of justice and the way that advances in technology could reach backward through time to illuminate crimes that seemed destined to remain mysteries. The DNA evidence that had finally identified Sarah's killer represented the convergence of scientific progress and investigative persistence, but it also highlighted the arbitrary nature of breakthrough moments. If Hartwell had not been arrested on the assault charges in Fulton County, if his DNA had not been entered into the national database, if the computer algorithms had not made the connection, Sarah's case might have remained unsolved for another decade or longer.
But now, as Evelyn reviewed her notes and prepared her questions, she felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that accompanied every major development in a long-running investigation. After 10 years of wondering, she was finally going to meet the person who had taken Sarah's life and destroyed the Crenshaw family's sense of security and normalcy. She was going to look into the eyes of a killer and try to understand not just what had happened, but why. The Fulton County Jail was a fortress of concrete and steel that housed the desperate, the dangerous, and the forgotten in a carefully controlled environment designed more for containment than rehabilitation. As Evelyn Lewis walked through the series of security checkpoints that separated the outside world from the institutional reality of incarceration, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always accompanied visits to correctional facilities. The air inside smelled of industrial disinfectant, cafeteria food, and something else that she had never been able to identify, but that seemed to permeate every jail and prison she had ever entered: the accumulated weight of human desperation. Thomas Eugene Hartwell was brought into the interview room by two corrections officers, his wrists and ankles shackled with chains that clinked softly as he shuffled across the linoleum floor. At 43, he appeared older than his chronological age, his face weathered by years of outdoor construction work and marked by the kind of premature aging that often accompanied a life lived on society's margins. His sandy brown hair was thinning, his pale blue eyes darted nervously around the room, and his hands showed the calluses and scars of someone who had spent decades working with tools and machinery. Evelyn studied Hartwell's face carefully as he was seated across from her at the metal table, searching for some indication of the violence she knew he was capable of. Some visible sign that would have warned Sarah Crenshaw to run if she had encountered him in a dark parking lot on that August night in 2000. But she saw only a man who looked tired, confused, and slightly frightened by the sudden upheaval in his routine existence. The banality of his appearance was somehow more disturbing than obvious menace would have been, a reminder that monsters often wore unremarkable faces. "Mr. Hartwell," Evelyn began, her voice steady and professional despite the emotional turbulence she felt at finally coming face to face with Sarah's killer. "I'm Detective Evelyn Lewis with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I'd like to talk with you about an incident that occurred in Troup County on August 3, 2000. Hartwell's expression remained blank for several seconds, as if he were searching his memory for any significance in that date.
When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat accent of rural Georgia, tinged with the wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of authority figures. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never been in no trouble in Troup County. This is about them assault charges, ain't it? My lawyer said y'all can't ask me about nothing else without him being here." The denial was expected, almost scripted in its predictability, but Evelyn had interviewed enough suspects over the years to know that initial responses often revealed more than intended. Hartwell's mention of his lawyers suggested that he understood the seriousness of his situation, but his claim of ignorance about Troup County might have been genuine. Many criminals develop the ability to compartmentalize their actions, allowing them to function in society while suppressing memories of their violent behavior. Marcus Webb, who had been observing from a chair near the wall, leaned forward slightly and spoke for the first time. "Thomas, we're not here about the assault charges. We're here about Sarah Michelle Crenshaw, a 19-year-old girl who was murdered 10 years ago. We have physical evidence that places you at the scene of her murder." The change in Hartwell's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders tensed, his breathing became more shallow, and his eyes shifted from confused wariness to something approaching fear. For a moment, he said nothing, and Evelyn could hear the distant sounds of the jail filtering through the walls, doors slamming, footsteps echoing down corridors, the indistinct murmur of voices speaking in languages she couldn't identify. "I want my lawyer," Hartwell said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I ain't saying nothing else till my lawyer gets here." The interview was suspended at that point, but Evelyn felt a sense of satisfaction despite the lack of a confession. Hartwell's reaction to Sarah's name had been revealing, suggesting recognition and guilt rather than genuine confusion. She had seen enough innocent suspects to know the difference between legitimate bewilderment and the calculated ignorance of someone trying to avoid responsibility for their actions. Over the following days, as the legal machinery of prosecution began to move, Evelyn and Marcus worked to build a comprehensive case against Hartwell that would extend far beyond the DNA evidence. They reviewed his employment records, discovering that in August 2000, he was working on a construction project in West Point, Georgia, just 15 miles from LaGrange. The project involved renovating a strip mall, and the work crew's schedule would have put him in the area during the evening hours when Sarah disappeared.
The construction company's records from 2000 were incomplete, stored in a filing cabinet in the owner's garage, and partially damaged by moisture over the years. But pay stubs and timesheets indicated that Hartwell had worked late shifts during the first week of August, finishing his workday around 10 p.m. each night. The timing was significant, placing him in the vicinity of Sarah's workplace during the critical window when she was abducted and murdered. Further investigation revealed that Hartwell had been living in Bremen, Georgia at the time, in a mobile home park that had since been demolished to make way for a shopping center. Former neighbors were difficult to locate, but the few who remembered him described a man who kept to himself, worked steadily, and occasionally drank too much at local bars. Nobody recalled any obvious signs of violent behavior, but several people mentioned that he seemed uncomfortable around women and rarely engaged in social activities. The more Evelyn learned about Hartwell's background, the more disturbing the picture became. He had grown up in a series of foster homes after being removed from his biological parents' custody due to severe neglect and suspected abuse. His educational records showed frequent absences and poor academic performance, and he had dropped out of high school during his junior year to work in a sawmill. His employment history was characterized by short-term jobs, frequent relocations, and occasional periods of unemployment that coincided with bouts of heavy drinking. But the investigation also revealed troubling gaps in the original case file, oversights that might have prevented Hartwell's identification if not for the DNA breakthrough. The construction site where he had worked in 2000 was less than 2 miles from the Dairy Queen where Sarah had been employed. Yet none of the investigators had canvassed the area's temporary workers or explored the possibility that the killer might have been someone passing through the community rather than a local resident. The oversight was particularly frustrating because several witnesses had reported seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck in the Dairy Queen parking lot on the night Sarah disappeared. The truck was described as older model Chevrolet or Ford, dark in color, with a toolbox visible in the bed. Construction workers routinely drove such vehicles, and a systematic check of the work crews operating in the area might have led to Hartwell's identification years earlier. Detective Ray Patterson, who had been the lead investigator on Sarah's case in 2000, had retired 5 years earlier and was now living in Florida. When Evelyn reached him by phone to discuss the breakthrough, she could hear the weight of regret in his voice as he acknowledged the missed opportunity. Patterson had been a dedicated officer with a good reputation, but the investigative techniques available in 2000 had been limited compared to current standards, and the pressure to solve active cases had often prevented the kind of exhaustive follow-up that cold case investigators could pursue. "We did the best we could with what we had," Patterson told her, during a lengthy conversation that stretched late into the evening. "But I've always wondered about that truck. We interviewed everyone we could find who knew Sarah, but we never really looked at the transient workers in the area. Construction crews, traveling salesmen, delivery drivers, people who might have been in town for just a few days or weeks." The conversation with Patterson highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of cold case investigations, the delicate balance between learning from past mistakes and avoiding the trap of second-guessing decisions that had been reasonable given the information available at the time. Evelyn understood that criticism of earlier investigators was rarely productive and could create unnecessary tension within the law enforcement community. But she also recognized the importance of identifying systematic problems that might be affecting other cases. As word of Hartwell's arrest spread through the law enforcement community, other investigators began reviewing their own cold cases for possible connections. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation initiated a comprehensive review of unsolved murders from the late 1990s and early 2000s, searching for cases that might have involved transient workers or victims who had disappeared from locations near construction sites. The review process was painstaking and emotionally draining, requiring investigators to revisit crime scenes, re-interview witnesses, and examine evidence that had been stored for years in property rooms and evidence lockers. But the effort soon yielded results that exceeded everyone's expectations. 3 additional cases showed potential links to Hartwell. The disappearance of Jennifer Lynn Walsh, a 22-year-old waitress from Columbus, Georgia, in 1998, the murder of Patricia Ann Simmons, a 17-year-old high school student from Noonan, Georgia, in 2001, and the unsolved death of Maria Elena Rodriguez, a 24-year-old factory worker from Rome, Georgia, in 2003. Each case shared disturbing similarities with Sarah's murder. The victims were young women who had disappeared from their workplaces or from areas near their jobs. Their bodies had been found in wooded areas, showing signs of sexual assault and violent trauma. Most significantly, construction projects had been active near each disappearance site during the relevant time periods, and employment records suggested that Hartwell had been working in or near each community when the crimes occurred. The emerging pattern suggested that Hartwell had been a serial killer whose crimes had gone undetected for years because of his transient lifestyle and the jurisdictional boundaries that sometimes hindered information sharing between law enforcement agencies. The revelation was both thrilling and horrifying for the investigators involved, representing a major breakthrough in multiple cases while highlighting the possibility that other victims remained undiscovered.
Linda Crenshaw's reaction to news of the additional cases was complex and heartbreaking. During a meeting with Evelyn at the GBI office, she struggled to process the information that her daughter's death might have been part of a larger pattern of violence that had claimed multiple victims. "I always wondered if there were others," she said quietly, tears streaming down her face. I used to lie awake at night thinking about other families going through what we went through, other mothers wondering what happened to their daughters. The support group that Linda had organized for families of murder victims became a crucial resource during this period, providing a forum for relatives of the newly connected cases to share their experiences and support one another through the complex emotions that accompanied the breakthrough. The meetings, held in the basement of the Methodist Church, grew larger and more intense as word spread about the possible serial killer connections. Robert Crenshaw channeled his emotions into helping other families navigate the legal system, sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over a decade of advocacy work. He created detailed timelines for each of the connected cases, mapping out potential travel routes and work assignments that might have brought Hartwell into contact with the other victims. His dining room table, which had been covered with Sarah's case materials for so long, now expanded to accommodate evidence and theories related to multiple murders. But the investigation also generated unexpected controversy within the law enforcement community. Some veteran investigators questioned whether the connections between the cases were as strong as they initially appeared, pointing out that similarities between crimes could be coincidental, and that the pressure to solve cold cases might be leading to premature conclusions. The debate was particularly intense regarding the Rodriguez case, where DNA evidence was limited and the cause of death had been difficult to determine due to the condition of the remains when they were discovered. Captain Morrison found himself in the difficult position of defending his cold case unit's work while acknowledging the legitimate concerns raised by his colleagues. During a tense meeting with representatives from multiple jurisdictions, he emphasized the importance of thorough investigation while cautioning against rushing to judgment based on circumstantial evidence. We have strong physical evidence connecting Hartwell to the Crenshaw murder. The other cases deserve the same level of scrutiny, and we won't make connections that aren't supported by solid evidence. The media attention surrounding the case created additional pressure on the investigation team. Local television stations and newspapers began running features about the North Georgia serial killer, a label that Evelyn found premature and potentially damaging to the prosecution of the cases. The coverage brought unwanted attention to the victims' families, forcing them to relive their tragedies in public while dealing with reporters who sometimes seemed more interested in sensational details than in the human cost of the crimes. Emma Lewis, Evelyn's teenage daughter, found herself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight when her mother's work became the subject of local news coverage. Classmates at school began asking her questions about the investigation, and she struggled to balance her pride in her mother's accomplishments with her desire for privacy and normalcy. The experience gave her new insight into the secondary effects of high-profile criminal cases and strengthened her resolve to pursue a career in criminal justice. The psychological profile that emerged from the connected cases painted a disturbing picture of a predator who had refined his techniques over time, becoming more sophisticated in his selection of victims and more careful about avoiding detection. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a forensic psychologist with the GBI, analyzed the crimes and concluded that Hartwell appeared to be an organized killer who planned his attacks carefully, selected victims who fit a specific profile, and took steps to minimize the risk of being identified or apprehended. This is someone who learned from experience, Dr. Richardson explained during a briefing for the investigating team. The early crimes show more impulsivity and risk-taking behavior, but the later cases suggest greater planning and control. He may have been refining his methods based on media coverage of the investigations, learning what mistakes to avoid and what techniques were most effective. The profile helped explain some of the investigative challenges that had hindered the original cases. Hartwell's transient lifestyle and careful victim selection had created a situation where each murder appeared to be an isolated incident, preventing law enforcement agencies from recognizing the pattern that connected them. His knowledge of construction work had given him access to remote locations suitable for disposing of bodies, and his understanding of small-town dynamics had helped him identify potential victims who worked evening shifts and were likely to be alone when leaving their jobs. The revelation that Sarah's murder might have been part of a larger pattern created new urgency around the investigation, but also introduced complications that tested the resources and coordination abilities of multiple law enforcement agencies. Each connected case required separate teams of investigators, distinct legal proceedings, and careful management of evidence that had been stored under different protocols and jurisdictional standards. Dr. Martinez found herself at the center of an unprecedented effort to process DNA evidence from multiple cold cases simultaneously. Her laboratory, which normally handled one or two major cases at a time, was suddenly tasked with analyzing dozens of evidence samples that had been collected over a span of several years. The work required careful prioritization and methodical documentation to ensure that the chain of custody remained intact and that the results would be admissible in court.
We're essentially conducting 4 separate investigations that happen to be connected by one suspect, Dr. Martinez explained to a gathering of prosecutors, investigators, and victim advocates. Each case has its own evidence, its own timeline, and its own legal requirements. We can't let the excitement of solving multiple cases compromise the quality of our work on any individual case. The pressure was particularly intense because Hartwell's public defender, Amanda Chen, was an experienced criminal defense attorney who specialized in challenging forensic evidence. Chen had already filed motions questioning the reliability of DNA analysis on evidence that had been stored for extended periods, and she was expected to mount an aggressive defense that would scrutinize every aspect of the prosecution's case. Chen's strategy became apparent during pretrial hearings, where she argued that the prosecution was attempting to link her client to multiple crimes based on circumstantial evidence and statistical correlations rather than concrete proof of guilt. She pointed out that construction workers routinely traveled between job sites, that DNA evidence could be transferred through secondary contact, and that the similarities between the cases might be coincidental rather than indicative of a single perpetrator. The legal challenges forced Evelyn and her colleagues to be even more meticulous in their investigation, documenting every piece of evidence with extraordinary care and building redundant support for their conclusions. The work was exhausting and sometimes frustrating, but it also demonstrated the importance of maintaining rigorous standards even when facing pressure to move quickly. As the investigation expanded, new witnesses began coming forward with information that had been buried for years under layers of fear, guilt, and simple forgetfulness. A former co-worker of Jennifer Walsh remembered seeing her talking to a man in a pickup truck outside the restaurant where she worked on the night she disappeared. A convenience store clerk recalled selling beer to someone matching Hartwell's description near the location where Patricia Simmons' body was found. A security guard remembered a suspicious vehicle parked near the factory where Maria Rodriguez worked during the weeks before her murder. None of the individual witness accounts was sufficient to prove Hartwell's guilt, but collectively they created a web of circumstantial evidence that supported the prosecution's theory of the case. The witnesses were older now, their memories affected by the passage of time, but their willingness to come forward demonstrated the lasting impact that unsolved crimes had on communities and the relief that people felt when justice finally seemed within reach. The emotional toll of the investigation was beginning to show on everyone involved. Evelyn found herself working 16-hour days, reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and coordinating with multiple agencies while trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life. Her relationship with David became strained as the demands of the case consumed more and more of her time and attention, leading to difficult conversations about priorities and the sustainability of her current level of commitment. Marcus Webb, despite his years of experience and his reputation for emotional resilience, began showing signs of stress that concerned his colleagues. He had difficulty sleeping, lost weight, and became increasingly irritable during routine interactions with other officers. The weight of representing multiple victims and their families, combined with the pressure of building cases that would need to withstand intense legal scrutiny, was pushing him toward burnout. The impact on the victims' families was even more profound. Linda Crenshaw found herself serving as an unofficial spokesperson for the other families. sharing her decade of experience navigating the criminal justice system while dealing with her own renewed grief as details of Sarah's murder were discussed in court proceedings and media coverage. The responsibility was both meaningful and overwhelming, forcing her to relive her trauma while helping others process their own. Robert Crenshaw's methodical approach to research and documentation became a model for other family members who wanted to contribute to the investigation. He organized volunteer efforts to digitize old police reports, created databases of witness information, and established communication networks that helped families stay informed about developments in their cases. His work was invaluable to the prosecution team, but it also consumed most of his free time and created tension in his marriage as Linda worried about his obsessional focus on the details of violent crimes. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns in how information had been shared or not shared between different law enforcement agencies over the years. Each jurisdiction had developed its own procedures for handling evidence, tracking suspects, and communicating with other departments, creating a patchwork system that sometimes hindered the identification of connections between cases. The discovery prompted discussions about statewide protocols for cold case investigations and the need for better coordination mechanisms.
Sheriff Tom Bradley of Troup County, who had been a patrol officer when Sarah was murdered, expressed frustration about the communication gaps that had allowed Hartwell to avoid detection for so long. "We had good investigators working these cases," he said during a press conference announcing the charges against Hartwell, "but we were all working in silos, focused on our own jurisdictions and our own evidence. Nobody was looking at the bigger picture, and that's something we need to fix." The media coverage of the case began to take on a life of its own, with reporters from Atlanta and other major cities traveling to LaGrange to interview family members, investigators, and community leaders. The attention brought resources and public interest to the cases, but it also created pressure on officials to provide regular updates and deal with speculation that sometimes distorted the facts of the investigation. Local business owners near the sites where the crimes had occurred found themselves answering questions from reporters and dealing with increased traffic from people who were curious about the locations. The Dairy Queen where Sarah had worked became an unofficial pilgrimage site for people following the case, creating uncomfortable situations for current employees who had no connection to the events of 2000. The psychological impact on the broader community was significant as people realized that a serial killer had been operating in their area for years without being detected. Parents who had children in 2000 remembered the fear they had felt after Sarah's murder, and many expressed anger that similar crimes had continued to occur while the perpetrator remained free. The revelation forced community leaders to confront difficult questions about public safety, police resources, and the balance between protecting privacy and sharing information that might prevent future crimes. High school students in Emma Lewis's class began studying the case as part of a criminal justice project, examining the investigative techniques used in each jurisdiction and analyzing the factors that had prevented earlier detection of the pattern. The project gave Emma new perspective on her mother's work and helped her understand the complexity of building cases that could withstand legal challenges while honoring the memory of victims and supporting their families. As the legal proceedings moved toward trial, the prosecution team faced the challenge of presenting 4 connected cases to juries who would need to understand the evidence without being overwhelmed by the complexity of the investigation. District Attorney Michael Harrison decided to prosecute the Sarah Crenshaw case first, using it as a foundation for the additional charges that would follow. The decision was strategic, based on the strength of the DNA evidence and the comprehensive nature of the investigation that had been conducted over the past decade. The announcement of the trial date created a new sense of urgency for everyone involved, as attorneys on both sides prepared arguments and evidence, while families braced themselves for the emotional ordeal of reliving their losses in public. For Evelyn, the approaching trial represented both the culmination of her professional efforts and a test of her ability to present the evidence in a way that would honor Sarah's memory and provide the closure that the Crenshaw family had been seeking for 10 long years. The courtroom in LaGrange was packed beyond capacity on the morning of October 15, 2010, as the trial of Thomas Eugene Hartwell began with a solemnity that seemed to acknowledge the weight of the moment.
Judge Patricia Williams, a 15-year veteran of the bench known for her fairness and attention to detail, had allocated 3 weeks for the proceedings, understanding that the case would require careful presentation of complex scientific evidence alongside emotional testimony from family members and witnesses. Evelyn sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in her best navy blue suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained copies of every document, photograph, and piece of evidence that had been gathered during the 10-year investigation. She had testified in dozens of trials over the course of her career, but this case felt different, more personal, and more consequential than any other she had handled. The months of preparation had led to this moment, when the truth about Sarah Crenshaw's murder would finally be presented to a jury of 12 citizens who would decide whether justice would be served. District Attorney Michael Harrison was a prosecutor with 23 years of experience and a reputation for handling complex cases with skill and compassion. He understood that the jury would need to grasp not only the scientific evidence that connected Hartwell to the crime, but also the human story that gave meaning to the technical details. His opening statement was measured and methodical, painting a picture of a young woman whose life had been cut short by violence and an investigation that had persevered through years of dead ends and false leads.
Sarah Michelle Crenshaw was 19 years old when she died, Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. She was working to save money for college, planning to become an elementary school teacher, looking forward to a future that would never come. On the night of August 3, 2000, she left her job at the Dairy Queen at 11:15 p.m., just as she had done dozens of times before. She walked across the parking lot to her car, turned the key in the ignition, and drove into the darkness. She was never seen alive again. The prosecution's case was built around 3 pillars of evidence: the DNA found under Sarah's fingernails, the circumstantial evidence placing Hartwell in the area at the time of the murder, and the pattern of similar crimes that suggested he was a serial killer who had been operating across North Georgia for several years. Each element required careful explanation to help the jury understand the significance of evidence that had been collected using techniques that were not widely understood by the general public. Dr. Rebecca Martinez took the stand on the second day of the trial, carrying with her the weight of scientific certainty and the responsibility of translating complex forensic procedures into language that could be understood by people without specialized training. She had prepared for her testimony by creating visual aids and simplified explanations that would help the jury grasp the significance of DNA analysis without becoming lost in technical details. DNA is like a genetic fingerprint, Dr. Martinez explained, gesturing toward a large chart that showed the basic structure of genetic material. Every person has a unique genetic profile, except for identical twins. When we find DNA evidence at a crime scene, we can compare it to known samples and determine whether they match with a high degree of scientific certainty. The DNA evidence from Sarah's case was particularly compelling because it had been found in multiple locations on her body and clothing, suggesting prolonged physical contact between victim and perpetrator. The samples had been preserved properly and tested using current laboratory standards, eliminating the possibility of contamination or degradation that sometimes affected older evidence. But Amanda Chen, Hartwell's defense attorney, was prepared to challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case. During her cross-examination of Dr. Martinez, she focused on the possibility of secondary transfer, the length of time the evidence had been stored, and the statistical methods used to calculate the probability of a false match. Her questions were precise and technical, designed to create doubt about the reliability of the scientific evidence. Dr. Martinez, Chen began, her tone respectful but skeptical. Isn't it true that DNA can be transferred from one person to another through indirect contact? For example, if my client had shaken hands with someone who had earlier been in contact with the victim. Dr. Martinez nodded carefully, understanding the importance of her response. Secondary transfer is possible in some circumstances, but the amount and location of the DNA evidence in this case makes that explanation highly unlikely. We found genetic material under the victim's fingernails, on her clothing, and on her skin in patterns consistent with direct physical contact during a struggle. The testimony continued for 2 days, with Dr. Martinez patiently explaining the procedures used to collect, preserve, and analyze the evidence, while Chen probed for weaknesses in the chain of custody and the laboratory protocols. The exchanges were technical and sometimes difficult to follow, but they established the scientific foundation that would support the rest of the prosecution's case. Evelyn's testimony began on the 4th day of the trial, and she felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and determination that always accompanied her appearances in court. She had reviewed her notes countless times and practiced her responses to likely questions, but she knew that Chen would attempt to discredit her investigation and question the conclusions she had reached. Harrison's direct examination focused on the thoroughness of the investigation and the care with which evidence had been preserved and analyzed. Evelyn walked the jury through the timeline of events, explained the significance of the construction work being performed near Sarah's workplace, and described the systematic approach that had eventually led to Hartwell's identification. "Detective Lewis," Harrison asked, "can you explain to the jury how the defendant was finally identified as a suspect in this case?" Evelyn turned toward the jury box, making eye contact with several of the jurors as she spoke. In January 2010, Mr. Hartwell was arrested on assault charges in Fulton County. When he was processed, a DNA sample was taken and entered into the national database. The computer system runs continuous comparisons between new entries and existing evidence from unsolved cases. When Mr. Hartwell's genetic profile was compared to the DNA found at our crime scene, the system identified a match. The explanation seemed to resonate with the jurors, several of whom took notes as Evelyn described the role of technology in solving cold cases. But Amanda Chen, Hartwell's defense attorney, was prepared to challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case. During her cross-examination of Dr. Martinez, she focused on the possibility of secondary transfer, the length of time the evidence had been stored, and the statistical methods used to calculate the probability of a false match. Her questions were precise and technical, designed to create doubt about the reliability of the scientific evidence. "Dr. Martinez," Chen said during a particularly intense exchange, "isn't it true that DNA can be transferred from one person to another through indirect contact? For example, if my client had shaken hands with someone who had earlier been in contact with the victim." Detective Lewis nodded carefully, understanding the importance of her response. "If it's possible, then yes, absolutely. But it's important to keep in mind that there is always the possibility of error or other explanations for what is being presented as evidence." The testimony continued for 2 days, with Evelyn patiently explaining the procedures used to collect, preserve, and analyze the evidence, while Chen probed for weaknesses in the chain of custody and the laboratory protocols. The exchanges were technical and sometimes difficult to follow, but they established the scientific foundation that would support the rest of the prosecution's case.
The question was designed to highlight the gaps in the original investigation while suggesting that Hartwell's rights had been compromised by the delay in identifying him as a suspect. Evelyn had anticipated the challenge and responded calmly, explaining the investigative priorities that had guided the original case and the technological limitations that had prevented earlier identification of the DNA evidence. The investigators in 2000 conducted a thorough investigation based on the information and technology available at that time, Evelyn replied. DNA analysis was expensive and time-consuming, and it wasn't routinely used unless other evidence was lacking. The national database that allowed us to identify Mr. Hartwell didn't exist in its current form until several years later. The testimony of Linda and Robert Crenshaw was among the most emotional of the trial, as they described their daughter's life, their decade-long search for answers, and the impact that her murder had had on their family and community. Linda spoke about Sarah's dreams of becoming a teacher, her close relationships with friends and family, and the devastating loss that had reshaped every aspect of their lives. Sarah was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel special, Linda testified, her voice breaking as she looked directly at the jury.
She remembered people's birthdays, she volunteered to work extra shifts when her coworkers needed time off, and she called her grandmother every Sunday without fail. She had her whole life ahead of her, and someone took that away from us. Robert's testimony focused on the investigative efforts he had undertaken over the years, the support group that Linda had organized, and the hope that had sustained them through a decade of uncertainty. His methodical presentation of facts and timelines helped the jury understand the persistence that had kept the case alive and the relief that the family felt now that someone was finally being held accountable for Sarah's death. But the defense also called witnesses who testified about Hartwell's character and background, painting a picture of a man who had struggled with poverty, abuse, and social isolation throughout his life. A former coworker described him as quiet and reliable, someone who worked hard and kept to himself. A social worker who had been involved in his case as a child testified about the severe neglect and trauma he had experienced in his early years. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychologist called by the defense, testified about the effects of childhood trauma on adult behavior and the statistical relationship between abuse and later criminal conduct. Her testimony was designed to provide context for Hartwell's actions without excusing them, offering the jury an explanation for how someone could commit such violent crimes while appearing unremarkable in other aspects of his life. Severe childhood trauma doesn't excuse criminal behavior, Dr. Walsh explained during her testimony, but it can help us understand how someone develops the capacity for violence and the psychological mechanisms that allow them to function in society while harboring dangerous impulses. The prosecution countered with testimony from Dr. Amanda Richardson, who had developed the psychological profile of the perpetrator based on the crime scene evidence and the pattern of connected cases. Dr. Richardson's analysis painted a picture of an organized killer who had planned his attacks carefully and refined his methods over time, suggesting a level of calculation and control that contradicted the defense's portrayal of Hartwell as someone whose actions were driven by uncontrolled psychological impulses. This is not someone who acted impulsively or lost control, Dr. Richardson testified. The evidence suggests careful planning, victim selection based on specific criteria, and post-crime behavior designed to avoid detection. These are the characteristics of an organized offender who understood the consequences of his actions and took steps to avoid them. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a focal point for the community's emotions about the case. Family members of the other suspected victims attended the proceedings, hoping to hear evidence that would help resolve their own cases. Community leaders used the trial as an opportunity to discuss public safety issues and the resources needed to prevent similar crimes. Media coverage intensified, with daily reports about testimony and evidence drawing attention from across the state. The revelation of additional connected cases had not been presented to the jury hearing the Sarah Crenshaw case, as Judge Williams had ruled that such evidence would be prejudicial and might confuse the issues. But the information had been widely reported in the media, creating a situation where community members were aware of allegations that the jury was not allowed to consider.
This parallel narrative created tension both inside and outside the courtroom as people struggled to separate the specific evidence in Sarah's case from the broader implications of Hartwell's alleged serial crimes. The families of the other suspected victims watched the proceedings with particular intensity, understanding that the outcome of this trial would likely influence the prosecution of their cases. On the 8th day of the trial, Hartwell's defense team surprised many observers by announcing that their client would testify in his own defense. The decision was risky, as it would expose Hartwell to cross-examination by the prosecution and allow the jury to evaluate his credibility and demeanor directly. But Chen believed that her client's testimony was necessary to counter the impression that his refusal to cooperate with the investigation was evidence of guilt. Hartwell's testimony was carefully scripted and limited in scope, focusing on his whereabouts on the night of August 3, 2000, and his assertion that he had never met Sarah Crenshaw or been to the Dairy Queen where she worked. He spoke quietly and hesitantly, frequently pausing to consider his words and occasionally looking toward his attorney for guidance.
I was working construction around that time. Hartwell testified when asked about his activities in the summer of 2000. I remember the job in West Point because it was hot and we were working long hours to finish before the school year started, but I never went to LaGrange and I never met that girl. I don't know how my DNA got mixed up in this, but I didn't hurt nobody. The testimony was unconvincing to many observers who noted Hartwell's inability to provide specific details about his activities or alibi witnesses who could corroborate his account. His claim that he had never been to LaGrange contradicted employment records and witness statements, creating additional credibility problems for the defense. Harrison's cross-examination was relentless, focusing on the inconsistencies in Hartwell's story and his failure to provide verifiable details about his whereabouts during the critical time period. The prosecutor's questions were designed to highlight the implausibility of Hartwell's explanations while reinforcing the strength of the physical evidence that connected him to the crime. "Mr. Hartwell," Harrison asked during one particularly intense exchange, "you've testified that you never went to LaGrange in the summer of 2000, but we have employment records showing that you worked on a construction project just 15 miles away. Are you telling this jury that in all the weeks you worked in that area, you never once drove through LaGrange or stopped at any businesses there?" Hartwell's response was hesitant and unconvincing. "I guess I might have driven through, but I don't remember stopping anywhere or meeting anybody. I usually just went straight home after work." The cross-examination continued for most of a day, with Harrison methodically dismantling Hartwell's explanations and forcing him to acknowledge the weakness of his alibi. By the time Hartwell left the witness stand, his credibility had been severely damaged, and his testimony appeared to have strengthened the prosecution's case rather than helping his defense. The closing arguments began on the 13th day of the trial, with both sides attempting to synthesize weeks of complex testimony into compelling narratives that would guide the jury's deliberations. Harrison's closing argument emphasized the strength of the DNA evidence, the thoroughness of the investigation, and the importance of holding Hartwell accountable for his actions. The evidence in this case tells a clear story. Sarah Crenshaw was murdered by Thomas Hartwell on August 3, 2000. We know this because science has given us the ability to identify him with certainty. The DNA evidence doesn't lie, it doesn't forget, and it doesn't change its story. Thomas Hartwell's genetic material was found on Sarah's body because he put it there during the commission of a violent crime. Chen's closing argument focused on the limitations of circumstantial evidence, the possibility of laboratory error, and the reasonable doubt that she argued should prevent a conviction based primarily on scientific evidence. She urged the jury to consider the human cost of a wrongful conviction and the importance of requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt before destroying someone's life. The prosecution wants you to convict my client based on statistical probabilities and scientific theories, but this is a court of law, not a laboratory. We're talking about a man's life, and you can't take that away based on possibilities and probabilities. If there's any reasonable doubt about my client's guilt, you must find him not guilty. The jury began deliberations on a Friday afternoon, retiring to a conference room where they would spend the next 2 days examining evidence, reviewing testimony, and debating the facts of the case. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved, as family members, investigators, and attorneys tried to predict the outcome based on the jury's questions and the length of their deliberations.
On Sunday evening, after nearly 8 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread through the community, with Linda and Robert Crenshaw sitting in the front row, holding hands and bracing themselves for the conclusion of their 10-year journey toward justice. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom at exactly 6:30 p.m. on Sunday, October 28, 2010, her black robes rustling softly as she took her place behind the bench. The atmosphere was electric with tension, every seat filled with people who had been touched by Sarah Crenshaw's case in some way: family members, investigators, community leaders, reporters, and ordinary citizens who had followed the trial with the intensity that comes from witnessing a moment of historical significance. The jury filed in slowly,
their faces revealing nothing about the verdict they were about to deliver. Evelyn studied each juror's expression, searching for some hint of their decision. But years of courtroom experience had taught them to maintain neutral expressions during these crucial moments. The foreman, a retired teacher named William Henderson, carried a folded piece of paper that contained the culmination of 10 years of investigation and 2 weeks of legal proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Williams began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "have you reached a verdict in the case of the state of Georgia versus Thomas Eugene Hartwell?" Henderson stood slowly, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find?" The pause seemed to last forever, though it was probably no more than a few seconds. Linda Crenshaw gripped her husband's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and Evelyn found herself holding her breath as she waited for the words that would determine whether justice would finally be served. "Guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of sobs, gasps, and quiet exclamations as the verdict settled over the crowd like a long-awaited thunderstorm. Linda Crenshaw collapsed into her husband's arms, 10 years of grief and hope finally finding release in tears that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Robert held her close, his own eyes wet with tears as he whispered words of comfort and thanksgiving into her ear. Evelyn felt a profound sense of relief wash over her, followed immediately by an overwhelming awareness of responsibility. The verdict was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a new phase in which the truth about Sarah's murder would need to be preserved, honored, and transformed into something that could prevent future tragedies. The conviction of Thomas Hartwell was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how many other cases remained unsolved and how many other families were still waiting for answers. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later, providing an opportunity for impact statements from family members and a final accounting of the crime's effects on the community. Linda Crenshaw spoke for nearly 20 minutes, her voice growing stronger as she described her daughter's life, her family's journey through grief, and her hopes that the conviction would provide closure for other families facing similar tragedies. Sarah would have been 29 years old now. She would probably be married, maybe have children of her own. She might have been teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school where I volunteer, sharing her love of learning with a new generation of students. You took all of that away from her, from us, from the world. But you didn't take away our love for her, and you didn't take away our determination to see justice done. Judge Williams sentenced Hartwell to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that reflected both the severity of his crime and the strength of the evidence against him. The sentence was met with approval from the gallery, although many observers noted that no punishment could truly compensate for the loss of Sarah's life or the decade of anguish that her family had endured. The conviction opened the door for prosecution of the other 3 cases that investigators believed were connected to Hartwell's activities. Over the following months, DNA evidence from the Walsh, Simmons, and Rodriguez cases was processed and analyzed, with Dr. Martinez's laboratory working around the clock to build scientific foundations for additional charges.
The results were mixed, but encouraging. Strong DNA matches were found in 2 of the 3 cases, while the 3rd provided circumstantial evidence that supported the prosecution's theory but fell short of the scientific certainty that had characterized the Crenshaw case. District Attorney Harrison made the decision to proceed with charges in all 3 cases, understanding that the families deserved their day in court, even if some convictions might be more difficult to obtain. Jennifer Walsh's parents, David and Carol, had divorced several years after their daughter's disappearance, their marriage unable to withstand the stress of an unsolved murder and the different ways they processed their grief. But they reunited in the courtroom for Hartwell's trial on Jennifer's case, presenting a united front in their pursuit of justice and their commitment to honoring their daughter's memory. The Walsh trial began in March 2011, with many of the same investigators and expert witnesses who had testified in the Crenshaw case. But each trial had its own character and challenges, shaped by the specific evidence available and the unique circumstances of each crime. The DNA evidence in Jennifer's case was less comprehensive than what had been available for Sarah's murder, requiring the prosecution to rely more heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Patricia Simmons had been only 17 when she was murdered, a high school senior who had been working part-time at a local bookstore to save money for college. Her parents, Michael and Dorothy Simmons, had spent 13 years advocating for their daughter's case, organizing annual memorial walks and lobbying for increased funding for cold case investigations. The breakthrough in Sarah's case had given them new hope, but they understood that each case would need to be proven independently. Maria Rodriguez's case presented the greatest challenges for prosecutors, as her body had been discovered several days after her death, and the condition of the remains had limited the amount of physical evidence that could be recovered. But her family's determination was no less intense than that of the other victims' relatives, and they had maintained pressure on law enforcement to keep her case active, even when leads seemed to dry up completely. The trial stretched over 18 months, with each conviction building momentum for the next case, while also revealing the limitations of the evidence available in older investigations. Hartwell was ultimately convicted in 3 of the 4 cases, receiving additional life sentences that ensured he would never be released from prison. The 4th case resulted in a hung jury, but prosecutors announced their intention to retry the case, demonstrating their commitment to pursuing justice for all the victims. The convictions had profound effects on the law enforcement community throughout Georgia, sparking discussions about cold case protocols, DNA databases, and the resources needed to investigate complex serial crimes. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced the creation of a specialized cold case unit with additional funding and enhanced technology, using the Hartwell cases as a model for systematic approaches to unsolved murders. Captain Morrison, who had supported Evelyn's work throughout the investigation, was promoted to Assistant Director of the GBI's Criminal Investigation Division, with a mandate to expand the state's cold case capabilities and improve coordination between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. His first initiative was the creation of a statewide database that would allow investigators to identify patterns across jurisdictional boundaries more easily. Evelyn found herself in an unexpected position as a leading expert on cold case investigations, receiving invitations to speak at conferences, train other investigators, and consult on difficult cases throughout the Southeast. The recognition was gratifying, but she remained focused on the practical work of solving cases and providing answers to families who had been waiting for justice. Her relationship with David had weathered the intense demands of the investigation, strengthened by his understanding of her dedication and her renewed commitment to maintaining better balance between her professional and personal responsibilities. Their children had watched the entire process unfold, gaining new appreciation for their mother's work and new understanding of the complexities of the criminal justice system. Emma Lewis's decision to pursue criminal justice had been reinforced by witnessing the Hartwell investigation, but she had also gained realistic expectations about the challenges and emotional demands of police work. She began volunteering with victim advocacy organizations while still in high school, developing skills that would serve her well in her chosen career.
Michael Lewis had initially been resentful of his mother's long hours and intense focus on work, but the successful resolution of the Hartwell cases had helped him understand the importance of her commitment to justice. His relationship with Evelyn improved significantly during his senior year of high school as he began to see her not just as his mother, but as a professional who was making a difference in the world. The support group that Linda Crenshaw had organized evolved into a formal nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting families of murder victims and advocating for cold case investigations. The group received funding from private donors and government grants, allowing it to expand its services and provide resources to families throughout Georgia and neighboring states. Robert Crenshaw's meticulous research methods became a model for family involvement in cold case investigations, and he began working with other families to organize their information and advocate effectively for their cases. His dining room table, which had been covered with Sarah's case materials for so long, was converted into an office space where he helped other families navigate the complex bureaucracy of law enforcement and legal proceedings.
The community of LaGrange underwent its own process of healing and reflection following the resolution of Sarah's case. The sense of safety that had been shattered by her murder was slowly restored, but the experience had also brought new awareness of the importance of supporting law enforcement and maintaining vigilance about public safety issues. Local businesses that had been affected by the investigation began working together to improve lighting, security cameras, and employee safety protocols. The Dairy Queen where Sarah had worked became a memorial site of sorts, with a small plaque installed near the entrance honoring her memory and the memory of other crime victims. The high school that Sarah had attended established a scholarship fund in her name, providing financial assistance to students who planned to pursue careers in education. The scholarship was funded through annual fundraising events that brought the community together and kept Sarah's memory alive for new generations of students who had not known her personally. Dr. Martinez continued her work at the State Crime Lab, but the Hartwell cases had given her new insight into the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining hope, even when cases seemed hopeless. She began teaching courses for law enforcement officers about the potential of DNA evidence and the importance of proper collection and storage techniques. The technological advances that had made Hartwell's identification possible continued to evolve, with new techniques for analyzing degraded DNA, expanded databases for comparing genetic profiles, and improved coordination between laboratories across the country. The success of the Georgia cases became a model for other states seeking to improve their cold case capabilities. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitude of law enforcement toward cold cases and the families of victims. The Hartwell investigation had demonstrated that persistence, technology, and community support could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles to solving old crimes. The success had renewed faith in the possibility of justice and strengthened the commitment of investigators to never give up on difficult cases. 3 years after Hartwell's conviction, Linda and Robert Crenshaw returned to the woods where Sarah's body had been found, accompanied by Evelyn and a small group of family friends. They had not visited the location since the investigation began, choosing instead to remember Sarah in happier places and contexts. But now, with justice served and their grief transformed into something resembling peace, they felt ready to confront the physical space where their daughter's life had ended. The area had changed in the intervening years, with new housing developments encroaching on what had once been isolated woodland, but the specific grove where Sarah had been discovered remained undisturbed, marked now by a small memorial garden that community volunteers had created and maintained. White roses, Sarah's favorite flowers, bloomed in carefully tended beds, and a stone bench provided a place for quiet reflection. Linda knelt beside the memorial, placing a framed photograph of Sarah in her graduation cap and gown against the stone marker that bore her name and dates. For the first time since the trial, she spoke directly to her daughter, her words carrying across the quiet woods like a prayer or benediction. "We did it, baby. We found him, and he can't hurt anyone else. You can rest now. We all can rest now." The transformation in the Crenshaw family was visible to everyone who knew them. The haunted quality that had marked their faces for so many years had been replaced by something approaching serenity. They still grieved for Sarah, and they still missed her every day, but the consuming anger and frustration that had defined their lives for a decade had finally been resolved.
Robert had returned to teaching with renewed energy, using his experience with the criminal justice system to enhance his civics classes and help students understand the importance of civic engagement and the rule of law. His students were fascinated by his first-hand knowledge of police procedures and legal proceedings, and many were inspired to consider careers in law enforcement or public service. The ripple effects of the Hartwell case continued to spread throughout the law enforcement community and beyond. Other states began reviewing their cold case protocols, seeking to replicate the success that Georgia had achieved through systematic investigation and improved technology. Federal funding for DNA analysis increased, and new initiatives were launched to process the backlog of evidence that had accumulated in crime labs across the country. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the forensic psychologist who had developed Hartwell's profile,
found herself in increasing demand as law enforcement agencies sought to understand the behavioral patterns that could help identify serial offenders. Her work on the Georgia cases had advanced the field of criminal profiling and provided new insights into the psychology of organized killers. The media attention surrounding the case had also brought national focus to the issue of missing and murdered young women, particularly those whose cases had received less attention because of their economic status or geographic location. Advocacy groups used Sarah's story to highlight the importance of thorough investigations, regardless of the victim's background or the resources available in their community. Emma Lewis graduated from high school with a clear sense of purpose and a deep understanding of the challenges that awaited her in criminal justice. She had been accepted to the University of Georgia's criminal justice program, where she planned to specialize in forensic science and cold case investigations. Her mother's work had shown her that individual dedication could make a difference, even in cases that seemed hopeless. Marcus Webb, who had been Evelyn's partner throughout the investigation, was promoted to lead the cold case unit when Evelyn moved to the state level. His steady temperament and methodical approach to evidence analysis made him an ideal choice for the position, and he brought the same patience and persistence to new cases that had characterized his work on the Hartwell investigation. The collaboration between different law enforcement agencies that had been necessary for the Hartwell prosecution became a model for future multi-jurisdictional investigations. New protocols were developed for sharing information, coordinating resources, and maintaining communication across county and state lines. The success of the Georgia cases demonstrated that cooperation and coordination could overcome the jurisdictional barriers that had historically hindered complex investigations. 5 years after the convictions, a documentary film crew approached the Crenshaw family about creating a feature-length film about Sarah's case and the investigation that had brought her killer to justice. After careful consideration, Linda and Robert agreed to participate, understanding that the publicity could help other families and raise awareness about cold case investigations. The documentary, titled 10 Years of Silence, premiered at film festivals across the country and was eventually broadcast on national television. The film followed the investigation from the initial crime scene through the DNA breakthrough and the subsequent trials, featuring interviews with investigators, family members, prosecutors, and even some of the jurors who had decided Hartwell's fate. The film's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Viewer response generated new tips in dozens of cold cases across the country, as people came forward with information they had previously kept to themselves. Several cases were solved as a direct result of the publicity, demonstrating the power of media attention to unlock evidence that had been hidden for years. But the documentary also brought unwanted attention to the Crenshaw family, as true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators began visiting LaGrange and attempting to contact Linda and Robert directly. The experience taught them about the complex relationship between publicity and privacy in high-profile criminal cases, and they had to develop new strategies for protecting their personal lives while continuing their advocacy work.
Evelyn, who had been featured prominently in the documentary, found herself dealing with similar challenges as her phone number and email address circulated among people interested in cold cases. While she was committed to helping other investigators and families, she also needed to maintain boundaries that would allow her to continue her professional work without being overwhelmed by requests for assistance. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation created a new position for Evelyn as Director of Cold Case Investigations, with responsibility for overseeing similar units throughout the state and providing training and support to local law enforcement agencies. The position allowed her to apply the lessons learned from the Hartwell investigation to a broader range of cases while maintaining the hands-on investigative work that she found most rewarding.
The success of the cold case program led to increased funding from the state legislature, with new resources allocated for DNA analysis, database management, and training programs. The investment paid dividends almost immediately as additional cases began to be solved using the systematic approaches that had been developed during the Hartwell investigation. Technology continued to advance at a rapid pace, with new techniques for analyzing trace evidence, improved database systems for tracking suspects across jurisdictions, and enhanced communication tools that allowed investigators to share information more efficiently. Each technological breakthrough had the potential to unlock cases that had been considered unsolvable just a few years earlier. The legal precedents established during the Hartwell trials also had lasting impact on the criminal justice system. Courts became more willing to admit DNA evidence from older cases, and new standards were developed for evaluating the reliability of evidence that had been stored for extended periods. The convictions demonstrated that justice could be served even decades after crimes were committed, providing hope for families who had given up on the possibility of resolution. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the renewed commitment it inspired among law enforcement officers to never give up on difficult investigations. The success of the Hartwell case became legendary within the police community, a reminder that persistence, technology, and community support could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Detective training programs began incorporating lessons from the Georgia cases, teaching new officers about the importance of evidence preservation, the potential of emerging technologies, and the value of maintaining hope even in the face of repeated disappointments. The case studies became required reading in criminal justice programs at universities across the country. The victim advocacy movement also gained momentum from the publicity surrounding the case, as Linda Crenshaw's support group evolved into a national organization that provided resources and guidance to families dealing with unsolved murders. The organization developed training programs for victim advocates, created resource guides for navigating the criminal justice system, and lobbied for legislation to improve cold case investigations. 10 years after Hartwell's conviction, the organization Linda had founded was serving families in 37 states and had helped secure funding for cold case units in dozens of jurisdictions. The work had grown far beyond what she had imagined when she first started meeting with other grieving parents in the basement of her church, but the core mission remained the same: ensuring that no family would have to face the darkness of an unsolved murder alone. 2 years later, 2012. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's new cold case facility in Atlanta buzzed with activity as Evelyn Lewis walked through the expanded laboratory spaces that had been built with federal grant money secured partly because of the Hartwell case's success. The facility represented a quantum leap in the state's ability to process DNA evidence and coordinate complex investigations, with equipment that could analyze genetic material that would have been considered unusable just a decade earlier. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been promoted to Director of Forensic Sciences for the entire state system, overseeing a network of laboratories that processed evidence from across Georgia and provided consultation services to neighboring states. The success of the Hartwell investigation had made her one of the most respected forensic geneticists in the Southeast, and she frequently testified in cases where DNA evidence was crucial to securing convictions. On this particular morning, Dr. Martinez was briefing Evelyn about a breakthrough in another cold case, the 1995 murder of college student Amy Chen in Athens, Georgia. DNA evidence that had been considered too degraded for analysis was yielding results using new extraction techniques, and the genetic profile that emerged had matched a convicted felon in the national database.
The technology keeps getting better, Dr. Martinez explained as she showed Evelyn the laboratory reports. What we couldn't analyze 5 years ago is routine now, and what we can barely analyze today will probably be simple 10 years from now. It makes you wonder how many cases we could solve if we could just keep the evidence long enough for the technology to catch up. The observation was both encouraging and sobering, highlighting the importance of evidence preservation while also acknowledging the limitations that current technology still imposed on cold case investigations.
But each advancement brought new hope for families who had been waiting years or decades for answers. And each success, like the Hartwell case, demonstrated that patience and persistence could eventually pay off. Emma Lewis was now a junior at the University of Georgia, majoring in criminal justice with a concentration in forensic science. She had spent the previous summer interning with the cold case unit, working alongside investigators who had been inspired by her mother's work to pursue careers in law enforcement. The experience had confirmed her career goals, while also giving her realistic expectations about the challenges and emotional demands of police work. During her internship, Emma had worked on the Amy Chen case, helping to organize evidence and track down witnesses who had moved to different states in the years since the original investigation. The work was painstaking and sometimes frustrating, but she had inherited her mother's patience and determination, along with a deep appreciation for the importance of justice in healing communities and families. Her brother Michael had surprised everyone by deciding to study journalism at Emory University, with a focus on investigative reporting and criminal justice issues. His mother's work had sparked an interest in the intersection between media coverage and law enforcement, and he hoped to pursue stories that could help solve cold cases and bring attention to forgotten victims. The documentary about Sarah's case had won several awards and had been translated into multiple languages, spreading awareness of cold case investigations internationally. The film had also generated ongoing revenue that Linda and Robert Crenshaw had donated to support cold case investigations and victim advocacy programs throughout the Southeast. 5 years later, 2015, Thomas Hartwell died in prison of natural causes at the age of 48, ending any possibility of learning more about his crimes or motivations. His death was noted briefly in local newspapers, but the families of his victims felt a complex mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that he could never harm anyone again, but frustration that many questions about his crimes would remain forever unanswered. Evelyn had attempted to interview Hartwell several times during his incarceration, hoping to gain insight that might help solve other cases or provide closure for families. But he had remained largely silent about his crimes, maintaining his innocence even when presented with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. His refusal to cooperate had been disappointing but not unexpected, as many serial killers never acknowledge their crimes or show genuine remorse for their actions. The cold case unit that Evelyn now directed had solved more than 60 previously unsolved murders since the Hartwell breakthrough, using improved technology, enhanced coordination, and the systematic approaches that had been developed during that landmark investigation. Each solution brought closure to families who had been waiting for answers, but it also highlighted how many other cases remained unsolved throughout the state. Linda Crenshaw had published a book about her family's journey through grief and their pursuit of justice, titled Sarah's Voice: A Mother's Quest for Truth. The book had become a bestseller in the true crime genre and had been adapted into a television movie that brought renewed attention to cold case investigations and victim advocacy issues. The royalties from the book and movie had funded the establishment of the Sarah Crenshaw Foundation, which provided grants for DNA analysis in cold cases, supported victim advocacy programs, and offered college scholarships for students pursuing careers in criminal justice and forensic science. The foundation had become a significant force in promoting cold case investigations throughout the country.
Robert Crenshaw had retired from teaching but remained active in the foundation's work, traveling to conferences and training sessions where he shared his experience with other families dealing with unsolved murders. His methodical approach to research and advocacy had become a model for family involvement in cold case investigations, and he had co-authored training materials used by victim advocacy organizations across the country. 10 years later, 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic had disrupted many aspects of law enforcement work, but cold case investigations had actually benefited from some of the changes forced by the crisis. Video conferencing technology had made it easier to coordinate multi-jurisdictional investigations, and the increased emphasis on DNA analysis for public health purposes had led to improvements in laboratory capacity and capabilities.
Evelyn, now 55 and serving as deputy director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, had overseen the expansion of cold case capabilities to include advanced genetic genealogy techniques that could identify suspects through their relatives' DNA profiles. The approach had revolutionized cold case investigations, allowing analysts to solve cases even when the perpetrator's DNA was not in any law enforcement database. Emma Lewis had graduated from law school and was working as a prosecutor specializing in cold cases, applying the lessons she had learned from her mother's career to the courtroom. Her first major case involved a 1987 murder that had been solved using genetic genealogy, and she had secured a conviction that brought closure to a family that had been waiting 33 years for justice. The prosecutor's office had created a specialized cold case unit that worked closely with law enforcement investigators to build cases that could withstand legal challenges. The unit had learned from the Hartwell prosecution that careful preparation and thorough documentation were essential for securing convictions in cases where evidence was old and witnesses' memories had faded. Marcus Webb had become the director of cold case investigations when Evelyn was promoted, and he had continued the systematic approach that had characterized their partnership. Under his leadership, the unit had developed partnerships with universities, private laboratories, and volunteer organizations that provided additional resources for processing evidence and investigating leads. The technology that had seemed revolutionary during the Hartwell investigation was now considered routine, replaced by even more sophisticated techniques that could extract usable DNA from increasingly small and degraded samples. Forensic laboratories were beginning to analyze evidence that had been considered hopeless just a few years earlier, leading to breakthroughs in cases that dated back decades. 15 years later, 2025, Sarah Crenshaw would have been 44 years old in 2025, possibly a grandmother herself, perhaps still teaching elementary school and inspiring new generations of students. The life she might have lived remained a source of sadness for her parents, but they had found meaning in the impact her story had on the broader struggle for justice and public safety. Linda Crenshaw, now 73, continued to lead the foundation that bore her daughter's name, though she had gradually transferred most day-to-day responsibilities to a professional staff. The foundation had funded DNA analysis in more than 3,000 cold cases, leading to hundreds of solutions and bringing closure to families across the country. The foundation had also established the Sarah Crenshaw Institute for Cold Case Studies at the University of Georgia, where researchers studied the most effective techniques for solving old crimes and training new generations of investigators. The institute had become a national center for cold case research, attracting students and professionals from around the world. Robert Crenshaw had passed away peacefully in 2023, 2 days after his 75th birthday, surrounded by family and friends who remembered him as a man who had transformed his grief into a force for justice. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his advocacy work, including families who had found closure through cold case investigations he had supported. Evelyn Lewis, now serving as director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, looked back on the Hartwell case as the defining experience of her career, but she also recognized that it was just one example of what could be accomplished when technology, persistence, and community support converged around the pursuit of justice. The lessons learned from that investigation continued to guide cold case work throughout the state and beyond.
The cold case unit had evolved into a sophisticated operation that utilized artificial intelligence to identify patterns across multiple cases, advanced DNA analysis to process evidence that would have been unusable just a few years earlier, and international databases to track suspects who had fled the country. But the fundamental principles remained the same: careful investigation, meticulous documentation, and never giving up on the possibility that justice could be served. Emma Lewis had been elected as district attorney for her judicial circuit, running on a platform that emphasized the importance of cold case prosecutions and victim advocacy. Her victory represented a new generation of prosecutors who understood the value of advanced forensic techniques and the importance of supporting families through the long process of seeking justice. As she prepared for her inauguration, Emma reflected on the journey that had begun with her mother's investigation of Sarah Crenshaw's murder and had led to a career dedicated to ensuring that no case would be forgotten and no family would be left without answers. The work was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, but it was also deeply meaningful, connecting her to a tradition of public service that stretched back through her mother's career and forward into a future where technology and determination would continue to unlock secrets that had been hidden for decades. The Hartwell case had demonstrated that time was not always the enemy of justice, that patience, persistence, and faith in the power of truth could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As new technologies emerged and new techniques were developed, the lessons of that landmark investigation continued to guide cold case work throughout the country, proving that some stories are too important to remain untold and some truths are too vital to remain hidden. In LaGrange, the memorial garden where Sarah's body had been found had become a place of pilgrimage for people dealing with unsolved crimes and unexplained disappearances. Visitors came from across the country to pay their respects and to draw inspiration from a story that had shown that justice, while sometimes delayed, was not necessarily denied. The white roses that bloomed there each spring served as a reminder that beauty could emerge from tragedy, that hope could survive even the darkest circumstances, and that love could transcend death itself. Sarah's story had become larger than her individual tragedy, transforming into a symbol of the possibility that truth would eventually emerge, that justice would ultimately be served, and that the voices of victims would never be completely silenced. In the quiet moments when case files were closed and families finally received the answers they had been seeking for years or decades, those who had worked on the Hartwell investigation could hear an echo of Sarah's voice reminding them that every victim deserved to be remembered, every family deserved to know the truth, and every case deserved the relentless pursuit of justice that had finally brought her killer to account. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. You'll get instant access to exclusive videos, behind-the-scenes content, and be the first to know about exciting updates. Every subscription helps us create even better content for you. Don't miss out on the fun. Subscribe now and become part of our incredible journey together.